Ethan Sterling had orchestrated the perfect scene for his final victory. A lavish engagement party at his family's waterfront estate, his beautiful model fiancée on his arm. The final, cruel touch, an invitation sent to his quiet, unassuming ex-wife, Amelia, ensuring she would witness the spectacular life he now had without her. He anticipated her quiet arrival, a ghost at his celebration. But the sound that shattered the polite applause wasn't part of his plan. It was the deafening roar of a helicopter descending on his perfect lawn. And when Amelia emerged poised and radiant on the arm of a legendary billionaire, Ethan's moment of triumph became his most public humiliation. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the immaculate lawns of the Sterling family's waterfront estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The air thick with the scent of salt from the Long Island Sound and the expensive perfume of the guests buzzed with polite chatter and the clinking of champagne glasses. It was the kind of idyllic scene Ethan Sterling had meticulously curated for his engagement party to Isabella Romano. Everything was perfect, from the cascading floral arrangements to the string quartet, playing softly near the infinity pool. Ethan, with his perfectly coiffed sandy blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached his cool blue eyes, moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man born into wealth. At his side, Isabella, a vision in a white couture dress that clung to her like a second skin, laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. She was, as Ethan had been telling everyone for weeks, a model. Her portfolio, he'd boast, was filled with high-fashion shoots from Milan and Paris. Her face, he'd declared, was about to be on the cover of every major magazine. To the casual observer, they were the picture of success and happiness. But for those who knew Ethan, there was a subtle, almost desperate edge to his joy. His eyes kept darting towards the winding driveway, a flicker of anticipation, or perhaps anxiety in their depths. He was waiting for one particular guest, his ex-wife, Amelia Rosewood. Amelia. The name itself felt like a ghost at the lavish party. It had been 2 years since their divorce, a messy affair that had been the talk of their privileged social circle. Ethan had painted her as the villain, the woman who couldn't keep up with his ambitions, the quiet, unassuming librarian who preferred dusty books to the dazzling limelight he craved. He had left her for Isabella, a woman he claimed was his equal in every way. "Darling, you seem tense," Isabella purred, her manicured hand tracing the lapel of his designer suit. "Is everything all right?" Ethan forced another smile. "Perfectly fine, my love. Just ensuring all our guests are comfortable." He kissed her cheek, a performative gesture for the benefit of a nearby society columnist, but his gaze strayed again. He needed Amelia to see this. He needed her to see the life he had built without her, the beautiful woman on his arm, the opulent celebration of his new beginning. It was the final triumphant chapter in the story of their failed marriage, and he wanted her to have a front-row seat to his victory. Inside the sprawling mansion, Amelia's older sister, Chloe, watched Ethan with a mixture of pity and contempt. Chloe, a sharp-witted lawyer with a no-nonsense attitude, had never liked Ethan. She had seen the way he had slowly chipped away at Amelia's confidence, the subtle digs, the backhanded compliments, the way he had made her feel small and insignificant. "He's a peacock, that one," Chloe muttered to her husband Mark. "All flash, no substance." Mark, a calm and steady presence, squeezed her hand. "He's insecure. That's why he needs all this." He gestured around at the extravagant display. "He needs to prove to everyone, especially himself, that he made the right choice." "Well, I hope Amelia doesn't show up," Chloe said, her voice laced with concern. "She doesn't need to see this. She's stronger than you think," Mark replied, his eyes softening. "She's been through the fire. This is just a little smoke." Meanwhile, Amelia was not in a car inching her way through the Greenwich traffic. She was several thousand feet above it, seated in the plush leather interior of a Sikorsky S-76 helicopter. The rhythmic thrum of the rotor blades was a soothing counterpoint to the nervous flutter in her stomach. Beside her sat a man whose presence was as commanding as the view of the coastline below. His name was Julian Croft, a titan of the tech industry, a name synonymous with innovation and immense wealth. Julian was the kind of man who didn't just enter a room, he owned it. His dark hair was threaded with a few distinguished silver strands at the temples, and his grey eyes held a depth and intelligence that could be both intimidating and incredibly captivating. He was a man who had built an empire from the ground up, a stark contrast to Ethan, who had inherited his. Amelia had met Julian, not in a library, but at a charity gala she had reluctantly attended at Chloe's insistence 6 months prior. She had been standing near a quiet corner, feeling like a wallflower in a room full of exotic blooms, when he had approached her. He hadn't asked about her social standing or her family name. He had asked about the book she was holding, a well-worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude. Their conversation had flowed effortlessly, a meeting of minds that had taken them both by surprise. In the months that followed, Julian had shown her a world she had only read about in books. He had taken her to private viewings at art galleries, to quiet, unassuming restaurants that served the best food she had ever tasted, to his secluded cabin in the Adirondacks, where they had spent hours talking by the fire. He had seen the quiet strength and intelligence that Ethan had so casually dismissed. He had not tried to change her. He had celebrated her for who she was. When the invitation to Ethan's engagement party had arrived, her first instinct had been to throw it away. But Julian, with his uncanny ability to see to the heart of things, had suggested a different approach. "Don't let him think he still has power over you, Amelia," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. "Don't let him think you're hiding. Let's go, but let's do it on our own terms." And so, here she was descending from the heavens in a billionaire's helicopter, about to make an entrance that would be anything but quiet and unassuming. Nervous, Julian asked, his hand covering hers. Amelia took a deep breath, the scent of expensive leather filling her lungs. "A little," she admitted. "It's just a lot of history down there." "History is just a story, Amelia," Julian said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "And tonight, we're going to start a new chapter." Down on the lawn, the first distant thrum of the helicopter blades reached the ears of the guests. It started as a low hum, a curiosity that caused a few heads to turn. But as the sound grew louder, more insistent, conversations faltered. The string quartet trailed off, one violin squeaking in surprise. All eyes turned towards the sky, searching for the source of the disruption. Ethan, in the middle of a self-congratulatory toast, faltered. He squinted, his perfect smile finally slipping. A helicopter. Who would be so audacious as to arrive at his party in a helicopter? The aircraft, a sleek, dark machine with the discreet but unmistakable logo of Croft Industries on its tail, circled once over the estate, a powerful, predatory bird surveying its territory. Then it began its descent, its destination, not the nearby helipad, but the vast empty expanse of the main lawn, a space Ethan had intentionally kept clear for its picturesque quality. The downdraft from the rotors sent a shockwave through the party. Champagne flutes wobbled napkins, took flight, and women clutched at their expensive hats. The carefully constructed artifice of the event was being literally blown away. Ethan's face, once a mask of smug satisfaction, was now a canvas of disbelief and fury. This was his day, his triumph. Who dared to upstage him in such a flagrant, ostentatious manner? The helicopter landed with a grace that belied its size and power. The blades began to slow their rhythmic chopping, fading to a gentle whir. A respectful silence fell over the crowd, a collective holding of breath. The door of the helicopter slid open, and a pair of elegant, understated heels touched the perfectly manicured grass. And then Amelia Rosewood stepped out. She was not the mousy, bookish woman they remembered. The 2 years since her divorce had been a quiet renaissance. She was wearing a simple but exquisitely tailored navy blue dress that highlighted her slender frame. Her honey blonde hair, which she used to tie back in a severe bun, now fell in soft waves around her shoulders. Her face, free of the perpetual anxiety that had once clouded her features, was serene and confident. She looked, in a word, radiant. But it wasn't just her transformation that stunned the crowd into silence. It was the man who followed her out of the helicopter, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. Julian Croft. A murmur rippled through the guests, a wave of recognition and awe. Everyone knew who he was. His face had been on the cover of Forbes, of Time, of every major business publication in the world. He was a legend, a man whose wealth and influence dwarfed that of everyone present, including the Sterling family. Chloe's jaw dropped. She looked at Mark, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning delight. "Well, I'll be damned," she whispered. Ethan stood frozen, the champagne flute slipping from his numb fingers and shattering on the stone patio. His carefully constructed world had just been hit by a Category 5 hurricane, and her name was Amelia. Isabella, for her part, looked utterly bewildered. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice a shrill whisper. "What's going on?" But Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too busy staring at his ex-wife, the woman he had discarded, the woman he had pitied as she walked across his lawn, hand in hand with one of the most powerful men in the world. The narrative he had so carefully crafted, the one where he was the victor and she was the vanquished, had just been spectacularly, irrevocably rewritten. And as Amelia and Julian drew closer, their presence eclipsing everything and everyone else, Ethan Sterling felt a sensation he hadn't experienced in a very long time. The cold, bitter sting of being utterly and completely overshadowed. The party was far from over, but for Ethan, the celebration had just come to a crashing, humiliating end. The real story, he was beginning to realize, was just getting started. The silence that had fallen over the party was so profound, it seemed to absorb all other sounds. The distant lapping of the sound, the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, the frantic beating of Ethan's own heart. As Amelia and Julian walked towards the throng of stunned guests, it was as if a spotlight had been switched on, illuminating them and casting everyone else into shadow. Amelia's composure was a masterpiece of understated elegance. She moved with a newfound grace, her head held high, her eyes clear and direct. The nervous, apologetic woman who had tiptoed around Ethan's moods was gone. In her place was a woman who was comfortable in her own skin, a woman who was not seeking approval, but who commanded respect simply by her presence. Julian, ever the master of his environment, was the epitome of calm authority. His gaze swept over the crowd, a brief, assessing glance that seemed to take in everything and everyone. He projected an aura of power that was not ostentatious, but innate. It was in the way he stood, the way he moved, the quiet confidence that radiated from him like a physical force. As they reached the edge of the patio, Chloe was the first to break the spell. A wide, genuine smile broke across her face as she rushed forward to embrace her sister. "Amelia, my God, you look incredible." She pulled back, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and relief. "You certainly know how to make an entrance." Amelia laughed, a sound that was richer and more confident than anyone remembered. "I had a little help," she said, her eyes twinkling as she glanced at Julian. Julian smiled, a warm, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious features. He extended a hand to Chloe. "Julian Croft, it's a pleasure to finally meet you, Chloe. Amelia has told me so much about you." Chloe, usually so unflappable, found herself momentarily flustered as she shook his hand. "The pleasure is all mine, Mr. Croft. Please call me Julian." Mark joined them, shaking Julian's hand with a firm, appreciative grip. "Mark, welcome. We were just admiring your mode of transport. It's more efficient than the traffic on the I-95, Julian replied smoothly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The spell was broken. A nervous titter went through the crowd as people began to whisper amongst themselves the name Julian Croft, repeated in hushed, reverent tones. The focus of the party had irrevocably shifted. No one was looking at the bride and groom-to-be anymore. They were all captivated by the unexpected arrival of the ex-wife and her billionaire companion. Ethan finally jolted out of his stupor, felt a hot flush of rage and humiliation. This was a calculated attack. It had to be. Amelia, the woman he had so easily dismissed, had orchestrated this entire spectacle to humiliate him. The thought was so galling, so utterly infuriating, that it momentarily eclipsed his shock. He stalked towards them, his face a mask of forced joviality that did little to hide the fury in his eyes. Isabella trailed behind him, her expression a mixture of confusion and burgeoning resentment. Amelia, what a surprise! Ethan's voice was a little too loud, a little too hearty. And you've brought a friend. He gestured dismissively at Julian, a pathetic attempt to regain control of the situation. Amelia's smile remained serene. Ethan, Isabella, you remember Julian, of course. She delivered the line with a quiet precision that was more cutting than any shout. Ethan's face tightened. He had in fact met Julian Croft once before at a disastrous business meeting where Croft had systematically dismantled Ethan's ill-prepared presentation, exposing its flaws with a surgical and ruthless efficiency. It was a memory Ethan had tried his best to bury. To have that same man here now on the arm of his ex-wife was a fresh and potent humiliation. Mr. Croft, Ethan managed to grit out his hand, still slick with the champagne he had dropped. An unexpected pleasure. Julian's gaze was cool and level. Sterling. He acknowledged him with a single dismissive nod before turning his full attention back to Amelia, a clear and deliberate signal of where his priorities lay. Isabella, sensing the shift in power and realizing she was being completely ignored, stepped forward. Well, now that you're here, you must have a drink, she said, her voice a high-pitched, saccharine trill. She gestured to a passing waiter. Champagne for everyone. She attempted to link her arm through Ethan's, a gesture of ownership, but it came across as desperate. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Amelia, a sharp, assessing glint in their depths. She was the model, the trophy. She was not used to being upstaged, especially not by the woman her fiancé had described as a dowdy librarian. The narrative Ethan had spun for Isabella about his ex-wife was a caricature of reality. He had painted Amelia as a mousy, uninspired woman who had held him back, a woman utterly devoid of the glamour and sophistication that Isabella supposedly embodied. Now faced with the radiant, confident Amelia, Isabella felt a flicker of doubt, quickly followed by a surge of competitive animosity. I must say, Amelia, Isabella began her smile as sharp as a shard of glass. I'm surprised to see you here. Ethan said you rarely go out. Before Amelia could respond, Julian answered for her, his voice smooth as silk, but with an underlying edge of steel. Amelia has a rich and varied social life. She simply chooses to spend her time with people of substance. The insult, though delivered with impeccable politeness, hung in the air, a direct hit on both Isabella and Ethan. Several guests standing nearby coughed to hide their smirks. The society columnist, a woman named Bitsy Hargrove, who thrived on such drama, was scribbling furiously in her notepad. Isabella's face flushed a blotchy red beneath her perfect makeup. And what is it you do exactly, Mr. Croft? She asked, her tone bordering on insolent. It was a foolish question. Everyone knew who he was. But she was flustered, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. Ethan shot her a panicked look. Isabella, darling. But Julian simply smiled, a predator toying with its prey. I dabble in technology. He said the understatement so profound it was almost comical. The facade of Isabella, the supermodel, was also beginning to show its own cracks. While she was undeniably beautiful, there was something about her that didn't quite ring true. Her stories about her high-fashion shoots were always vague, lacking in specific details. She had a habit of name-dropping designers and photographers, but in a way that sounded rehearsed, as if she had memorized them from a magazine. Chloe, ever the sharp-eyed lawyer, had noticed it from the beginning. A few weeks prior, out of a combination of suspicion and sisterly concern, she had done a little digging. A quick search on the major modeling agency websites had yielded no results for an Isabella Romano. There were no editorials, no runway appearances, no high-profile campaigns. There were, however, a few rather grainy images of her on the website of a much less glamorous promotional modeling agency, the kind that hired women to hand out flyers at trade shows and smile prettily at corporate events. The Milan and Paris portfolio was, it seemed, a complete fabrication. As the evening wore on, the contrast between the two women became increasingly stark. Amelia engaged in a quiet but animated conversation with a renowned art collector, and a federal judge was a picture of intelligence and grace. Julian, always by her side, would interject with a witty remark or a perceptive observation, the two of them a seamless and formidable team. Isabella, on the other hand, grew more and more agitated. She clung to Ethan's arm, her laughter becoming louder and more shrill. She tried to redirect the conversation back to herself, to her career, but her attempts fell flat. The guests were more interested in catching a word with Julian Croft or in congratulating Amelia on how well she looked. The breaking point came when Bitsy Hargrove, the society columnist, approached Isabella with a saccharine smile and a pointed question. "Isabella, darling, you look divine. That dress is a masterpiece. Tell me, which of your upcoming campaigns are you most excited about? My readers are dying to know all about your work." Isabella froze, a deer in the headlights. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She shot a desperate, pleading look at Ethan. Ethan, who had been nursing a whiskey, and his wounded pride stepped in his voice, slurring slightly. "Isabella is between projects at the moment. She's taking some time off to focus on us." It was a weak, unconvincing lie, and everyone knew it. Bitsy's smile widened. She had her story. The final crushing blow came from an unexpected source. Ethan's own father, a stern, old-money patriarch who valued substance over style, had been observing the evening's events with a grim, disapproving expression. He had never been particularly fond of Amelia, but he had respected her intelligence and her quiet dignity. It was becoming increasingly clear, not impressed with his son's choice of fiancée. He approached Julian Croft, extending a hand. "Arthur Sterling, a pleasure to have you at our home, Mr. Croft." "Julian, please," Julian replied, shaking his hand. "Julian," Arthur Sterling said, his voice a low rumble. "I've been an admirer of your work for years. What you've done with renewable energy is nothing short of revolutionary." And the two men fell into a deep conversation about business and technology, a conversation from which Ethan was pointedly excluded. He stood on the periphery, watching as his own father, the man whose approval he had craved his entire life, gave more respect and attention to his ex-wife's new partner in 5 minutes than he had given to Ethan in 5 years. The carefully constructed world that Ethan had built for himself was crumbling around him, brick by painful brick. The model fiancée was being exposed as a fraud. His ex-wife, the woman he had cast off, had returned not as a victim, but as a queen with a king at her side. And the respect and admiration he so desperately craved were being lavished not on him, but on the man who had replaced him. He looked across the patio at Amelia. She was laughing at something Julian had said, her face illuminated with a joy he had never been able to give her. And in that moment, for the first time, Ethan Sterling felt a pang of something more profound than just wounded pride. He felt a flicker of regret, a dawning, terrifying realization that he had not just lost a wife, he had thrown away a treasure. The party, His grand celebration of his supposed triumph had become a public spectacle of his own failure. And the night was far from over. The party limped to a close, not with a bang, but with the quiet, awkward fizzle of a dying firework. The guests, having witnessed the social equivalent of a hostile takeover, made their excuses and departed their minds buzzing with the delicious scandal they would be dissecting for weeks to come. The string quartet had long since packed up their delicate melodies, no match for the drama that had unfolded. Ethan and Isabella stood amidst the debris of their perfect evening, the half-empty glasses, the discarded napkins, the wilting flowers. The silence between them was heavy and accusatory. "Well," Isabella finally said, her voice stripped of its earlier sweetness, now brittle and sharp. "That was a disaster." Ethan, who was now on his third or fourth whiskey, rounded on her. "A disaster? You think this was a disaster? My ex-wife, the woman I told you was a nobody, shows up in a helicopter with Julian Croft. Julian freaking Croft. And you want to talk about a disaster? Don't you dare blame me for this." Isabella shot back, her carefully constructed mask of poise finally shattering. "You're the one who invited her. What did you expect? That she would crawl here on her hands and knees, begging for you to take her back?" "I expected her to see what she had lost," Ethan roared, his voice echoing across the empty patio. "I expected her to be miserable. Instead, she swans in here with a billionaire looking like she just stepped off the cover of a magazine, while my fiancée, the supposed supermodel, can't even answer a simple question about her career." The word supermodel dripped with sarcasm, and the accusation hit its mark. Isabella flinched as if struck. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "You're the one who wanted me to be a model. You're the one who told me to embellish my resume. You said it would sound better." Ethan stared at her, his drunken brain slowly processing her words. "I suggested you highlight your experience. I didn't tell you to invent a career in Parisian high fashion." "What was I supposed to do?" she cried, tears now streaming down her face, ruining her expensive mascara. "You wanted a trophy, Ethan. Someone to show off to your rich friends. You didn't want me. You wanted a fantasy. And now that a bigger, better fantasy has shown up, you're blaming me." The raw, ugly truth of her words sobered Ethan more than a pot of black coffee ever could. He had wanted a fantasy. He had wanted a woman who was the polar opposite of Amelia, glamorous, exciting, a living, breathing testament to his own success. He hadn't cared about who Isabella really was any more than he had truly valued who Amelia had been. He had only cared about the image they projected, the role they played in the grand production of his life. His gaze fell on the shattered champagne flute on the ground, its sharp edges glinting in the moonlight. It was a perfect metaphor for his life, a glittering, fragile thing that had been shattered by the arrival of an undeniable, unshakable reality. Meanwhile, a few miles up the coast, the helicopter was descending towards a discreet, private helipad on the grounds of Julian Croft's sprawling estate. The property was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a symphony of glass and steel and natural wood that blended seamlessly into the rugged coastline. It was a home that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. As they walked towards the house, the cool night air was a welcome relief after the stuffy, tense atmosphere of the party. "Are you all right?" Julian asked, his arm still protectively around Amelia. Amelia took a deep breath, the scent of the sea and the pine trees filling her lungs. "I think so," she said, a small wry smile playing on her lips. "That was more dramatic than I anticipated." "You were magnificent," Julian said, his voice soft but firm. "You faced him with grace and dignity. You didn't let him diminish you." They entered the house, the interior of which was as elegant and understated as the exterior. A fire was roaring in the massive stone fireplace, casting a warm, inviting glow over the room. Amelia sank into one of the plush sofas, the exhaustion of the evening suddenly hitting her. "He looked broken," she said quietly, more to herself than to Julian. "He looked like a man who has built his life on a foundation of sand, and the tide just came in." Julian replied, his voice devoid of pity. He walked over to the bar and poured 2 glasses of a rare single malt scotch. He handed one to Amelia. He always wanted to be the hero of his own story, Amelia mused, staring into the amber depths of the liquid. But he could never quite manage it. He was always competing with his father, with his friends, with some imagined rival. He thought that by diminishing me, he could make himself seem bigger. That's the flaw in his character, Julian said, sitting down beside her. A truly strong man doesn't need to diminish anyone to feel powerful. He finds his strength in lifting others up. He paused, his grey eyes searching her face. He never deserved you, Amelia. Amelia looked at him, at this incredible, brilliant and kind man who had come into her life and shown her what it meant to be truly seen, to be truly valued. The last vestiges of her old life, the lingering shadows of her marriage to Ethan, seemed to finally recede, burned away by the warmth of the fire and the strength of Julian's presence. Chloe did some digging, Amelia said, a mischievous glint in her eye. On our dear Isabella. Julian raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what did the intrepid Chloe discover? It seems Miss Romano's Parisian runway career consists primarily of handing out energy drinks at a trade show in New Jersey. Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. I'm not surprised. There was a desperation about her. The kind of person who is so busy trying to be someone they forget to become anyone. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant roar of the ocean. He'll be furious, Amelia said finally. This isn't over. Let him be furious, Julian said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. His anger is the impotent rage of a man who has lost control. He has no power over you anymore, Amelia. Remember that. He took her glass and placed it on the table. Then he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The past is a ghost, Amelia. It only has the power to haunt you if you let it. Your future, our future, is right here. He leaned in and kissed her a kiss that was not about passion or desire, but about comfort and safety, and the promise of a new beginning. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the strength of the man she was falling in love with, Amelia Rosewood knew that she was finally truly free. The drama of the party, the humiliation of her ex-husband, the unraveling of his carefully constructed lies. It was all just noise. The real story was the quiet, profound, and beautiful one that was just beginning to unfold here in this house with this man. The next morning, the story of the Sterling engagement party was all over the society pages, just as Ethan had hoped. But it was not the story he had envisioned. The headlines were not about his beautiful fiancée or his lavish celebration. They were about the spectacular arrival of his ex-wife and the enigmatic billionaire Julian Croft. Bitsy Hargrove's column was a masterpiece of innuendo and thinly veiled scorn, painting a vivid picture of Ethan's humiliation and Isabella's transparent desperation. The fallout was swift and brutal. Ethan's father, Arthur Sterling, summoned him to his office for a meeting that was less of a conversation and more of a dressing down. He was furious not just about the public spectacle, but about the cheap, transparent fraud his son was planning to marry. He made it clear that if Ethan went through with the wedding, he would be cut off both financially and personally. For Ethan, it was the ultimate blow. The one thing he had always been able to count on, the Sterling name and the fortune that came with it, was now being threatened. And it was all because of Amelia. His resentment towards her hardened into a cold, bitter hatred. Isabella, facing a future without the Sterling millions, packed her bags and disappeared, leaving behind a short, vicious note that blamed Ethan for everything. Her modeling career was over before it had even begun. Her 15 minutes of fame, a humiliating exposé of her own deceptions. Ethan was left alone in his cavernous, empty mansion, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. He had lost his fiancée, the respect of his father, and his standing in the social circle he so desperately wanted to impress. But most of all, he had lost the narrative. He was no longer the hero, the victor, the man who had it all. He was a cautionary tale, a punchline, the man who had been upstaged at his own party by the ex-wife he had so foolishly underestimated. And as he sat there stewing in his own bitterness, a new dangerous thought began to form in his mind. If he couldn't have his happy ending, then he would make sure that Amelia didn't get hers either. He had lost everything. Now it was her turn. The drama was far from over. It was about to enter a new, much darker chapter. The weeks following the disastrous engagement party were a study in contrasts. For Amelia, life blossomed in ways she had never imagined. Her relationship with Julian deepened, built on a foundation of mutual respect, intellectual curiosity, and a quiet, profound affection. She quit her job at the local library and, with Julian's encouragement and financial backing, started a foundation dedicated to promoting literacy and preserving rare books, a passion she had long nurtured but had never had the confidence or the resources to pursue. She moved out of the small, sterile apartment she had rented after her divorce and into a charming, sun-drenched brownstone in a historic part of the city, a home that Julian had bought for her, not as a gift, but as an investment in her future, in their future. For the first time in her life, Amelia felt not just happy, but fulfilled. She was no longer a supporting character in someone else's story. She was the protagonist of her own. For Ethan, however, the weeks were a slow, agonizing descent into a personal hell of his own making. The society pages had moved on to other scandals, but the memory of his humiliation lingered. His father had made good on his threat, freezing his trust fund and removing him from the board of the family company. His friends, never more than fair-weather companions, now avoided his calls. He was a pariah, a social leper, haunted by the ghost of his own hubris. His days were spent rattling around the empty mansion, a bottle of expensive scotch, his only constant companion. The anger that had initially been directed at Isabella, at his father, at the world, now coalesced into a singular obsessive focus, Amelia. In his warped, alcohol-fueled logic, she was the architect of his downfall. She had conspired with Julian Croft to humiliate him, to destroy him. The fact that he had invited her to the party, that he had intended to flaunt his new life in her face, was a detail his bruised ego conveniently erased. He was the victim, she was the villain, and she had to pay. His first attempts at revenge were petty and childish. He started rumors, whispering to anyone who would listen, that Amelia was a gold digger, that she had been having an affair with Julian long before the divorce. But the rumors failed to gain traction. Anyone who saw Amelia and Julian together could see the genuine affection between them. And Amelia's new foundation, which was already making headlines for its innovative programs, painted a picture not of a gold digger, but of a dedicated philanthropist. Frustrated, Ethan's schemes grew more elaborate and more dangerous. He hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Julian Croft, convinced that the billionaire must have skeletons in his closet. But Julian's life, both personal and professional, was remarkably clean. The investigator found nothing. Ethan's obsession began to consume him. He started following Amelia, parking his car down the street from her new brownstone, watching her come and go. He saw her laughing with Julian, saw the easy intimacy between them, and each sighting was like a fresh twist of the knife in his gut. One evening, his desperation boiled over into action. He saw Amelia leave her house alone, dressed for an evening out. He knew Julian was in Singapore for a tech conference. He had read about it in the financial news. This was his chance. He followed her to a small, elegant restaurant in a quiet neighborhood. He watched as she was seated at a table for one near the window, a book open in front of her. The sight of her, so serene and self-contained, so perfectly happy without him, sent a fresh wave of rage through him. He stormed into the restaurant, his face flushed, his eyes wild. He marched up to her table, slamming his hands down on it, causing the other diners to turn and stare. "Having a nice dinner, are we?" He snarled, his voice thick with malice. "Celebrating your victory?" Amelia looked up, her expression one of weary surprise, not fear. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" "I'm here to talk about what you did to me," he hissed, leaning closer, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You and your billionaire boyfriend. You think you can destroy my life and get away with it?" "Ethan, you're making a scene," Amelia said calmly, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You need to leave. I'm not going anywhere until you admit what you did," he shouted, his voice rising. The restaurant manager, a large, imposing man, started to move towards them. "I didn't do anything to you, Ethan," Amelia said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "You did this to yourself. You were so blinded by your own ego, so desperate to win, that you threw away everything that mattered. Now, for the last time, leave me alone." Her words, so calm and so true, seemed to enrage him further. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You're not going to get away with this," he seethed. But before he could say another word, two men in dark suits materialized on either side of him. They were Julian's security detail. Julian, ever the strategist, had insisted on providing Amelia with protection, a precaution she had initially resisted, but for which she was now profoundly grateful. "Sir," one of the men said, his voice calm but firm, "you need to let go of the lady." Ethan, suddenly faced with two men who were twice his size, seemed to deflate. His hand dropped from Amelia's arm. He was unceremoniously escorted out of the restaurant, shouting threats and obscenities over his shoulder. The incident, though frightening, was a turning point for Amelia. It made her realize that Ethan was not just a bitter ex-husband. He was unstable and potentially dangerous. When Julian returned from Singapore, she told him everything. Julian's reaction was cold, quiet fury. He listened intently, his jaw tight, his grey eyes like chips of ice. When she had finished, he said only one thing. "This ends now, our son." Julian was not a man who made idle threats. He was a man of action, a man who understood power and how to wield it. He knew that a restraining order would do little to deter a man as obsessed as Ethan. He needed to be neutralized, not just legally, but financially and socially. Julian set his own plan in motion, a plan that was as brilliant as it was ruthless. He knew that Ethan's only remaining asset was the Sterling family name and the crumbling illusion of respectability that came with it. And he knew just how to shatter that illusion for good. He hired his own team of investigators, not to dig up dirt, but to find the truth. They delved into the finances of the Sterling family company, the company from which Ethan had been so unceremoniously fired. What they found was a pattern of mismanagement, of risky and unethical investments, of a company that was not just struggling, but teetering on the brink of collapse. And at the heart of the decay was a series of disastrous decisions made by one man, Ethan Sterling. It turned out that Ethan, in his desperate attempt to prove himself to his father, had made a series of reckless high-stakes bets on the stock market, using company funds to do so. He had falsified records, cooked the books, and lied to the board of directors. He had not just been an incompetent executive, he had been a criminal. Julian now held Ethan's entire future in his hands. He could go to the authorities, expose the fraud, and send Ethan to prison for a very long time. It would be the ultimate final revenge. He called a meeting, not with Ethan, but with his father, Arthur Sterling. The two men met in Julian's office, a sleek, minimalist space high above the city. Julian laid it all out, the evidence of Ethan's fraud spread across the polished mahogany of his desk. He didn't make threats. He didn't need to. He simply presented the facts. Arthur Sterling, a man who had built his life on a reputation of integrity and old money respectability, was devastated. His face, already etched with the lines of age and disappointment, seemed to crumble. His son was not just a failure, he was a disgrace. "What do you want?" Arthur asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I want him to leave Amelia alone," Julian said, his voice cold and hard. I want him out of her life permanently, and I want to ensure that he never has the power to harm anyone ever again. Julian then laid out his terms. He would not go to the authorities on one condition. Arthur would sell the struggling Sterling company to Croft Industries for a fraction of its former value. Julian would absorb its assets, salvage what he could, and prevent a catastrophic collapse that would have taken the jobs and pensions of hundreds of employees with it. In return, Arthur would use the proceeds of the sale to quietly clean up the financial mess his son had made, and then he would send Ethan away. Not to prison, but to a place where he could no longer harm himself or others. There's a private psychiatric facility in Switzerland, Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. It's discreet, it's secure, and it's very, very far away. He'll get the help he so clearly needs, and he will stay there indefinitely. It was a brilliant, ruthless move. It was not just about punishment, it was about containment. It would neutralize Ethan completely, stripping him of his name, his money, and his freedom, all without the messy publicity of a criminal trial. It was a checkmate delivered with the cold, calculating precision of a grandmaster. Arthur Sterling, faced with the ruin of his family's reputation and the imprisonment of his only son, had no choice but to agree. It was a bitter, humiliating pill to swallow, but it was the only way to salvage what little was left of his family's legacy. A few days later, Ethan received a visit from his father. He was told that he was leaving immediately. His protests, his threats, his pleas, they were all met with a stony, implacable silence. He was a broken man, defeated not by a dramatic public showdown, but by the quiet, inexorable logic of his own self-destruction. As he was escorted from the mansion he had once lorded over, he caught a final glimpse of his reflection in the polished surface of the grand piano. He saw a pale, haggard man with empty eyes, a ghost in his own home. He had wanted to be the hero of his own story, but he had become the architect of his own cage. Amelia learned of Ethan's fate not from Julian, but from a short, formal letter from Arthur Sterling's lawyers. It informed her that Ethan had been sent abroad for an extended period of medical treatment and would not be returning. She felt not triumph, not joy, but a profound and quiet sense of relief. The final chapter of that dark, painful part of her life was finally truly over. She was free. That evening, as she and Julian stood on the balcony of her brownstone, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "It's over," she said softly. "Yes," Julian replied, his arm tightening around her. "It is." They stood in silence, watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon. The drama, the revenge, the pain, it all seemed to melt away with the fading light, leaving behind only the quiet promise of the future. The real story, the one about love and healing and building a new life on a foundation of strength and respect, was just beginning. And for the first time, Amelia Rosewood looked towards the future with a heart full of hope and a soul completely at peace. And so the story that began with a gaudy display of ego at a waterfront party ended in the quiet, unshakable strength of a love built on truth. Ethan Sterling, who tried to write a narrative of triumph, ended up the author of his own downfall, a prisoner of the very lies he tried to live. Amelia, the ex-wife he so carelessly cast aside, didn't need revenge. She simply chose to live well, to find her own power, and in doing so, she rewrote her own destiny. Her happily ever after wasn't about the billionaire or the helicopter. It was about reclaiming her own story. What do you think? Was Julian's solution a masterstroke of justice or a cold, calculated act of power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by Amelia's journey from a quiet ex-wife to a powerful woman in her own right, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this story with your friends and subscribe for more tales of dramatic twists and ultimate vindication. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to you. Thanks for listening.